Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Dennis Fritz, retired Air Force Command Chief Master Sergeant, who between 2005 and 2008 served at the Pentagon in the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which is the third most powerful position in the Pentagon. And also, he is the author of this book, Deadly Betrayal, The Truth about why the United States invaded Iraq. So welcome to the program, and it's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. It's my honor to be here with you today.
So I found the book, to be absolutely fascinating, and not well, given your position, your clearance, you pretty much seen everything, and also it's extremely relevant because of the very specific role that you had, as you write in the book. Uh, you were the person then responsible for analyzing this whole paper trail, all the documents related to the invasion of Iraq. And again, you got some real insights into the dishonesty and how wars are sold to the public, which involves not just deceiving the public, but also betraying the soldiers who devoted their lives to serving their country. So it's incredibly fascinating. I can't recommend this book enough. And what's also fascinating is you draw a line from those days to the current wars. And indeed, if we look at the issues being discussed back then, we're still more or less fighting, not just in the same region, but fighting against the same countries. So, but I thought a good place to start was perhaps your background. How would you describe your career, and why did you write this book?
Well, thanks, Glenn. I will start off by saying I had an unusual enlisted career. In fact, I would probably say that I had the path of, on the enlisted side, of being a general officer, and I mean it all candidly because of the fact I spent a lot of my time in the Pentagon as a young enlisted man and went through the ranks to achieve the highest enlisted rank. And through that career, my time in the Pentagon, working at all levels from the Air Staff, which is the headquarters for the Air Force. I worked at the Secretary of the Air Force level for legislative affairs, where we coordinated with Capitol Hill, U.S. Congress, for the needs of the Air Force. And I also had opportunity, as you alluded to from my short bio, working in the Undersecretary of Defense Policy, which at the time was the third highest ranking position in the civilian leadership of the Pentagon, who happened to be at the time, your audience may have heard of Doug Feith at the time when I went in, and under Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And so during that time, as my last 10 years, I had the honor of being an advisor to general officers. And the last 5 or 6 were at the 4-star level. I was the advisor to the Commander of Pacific Air Forces. I was the advisor to the Commander of the United States Air Force Space Command. And then we also had what we call a Joint Command of Space Command, which would include all the U.S. services. And I also had an additional duty as the advisor to the Commander of NORAD. And so I had a somewhat unusual career, enlisted path. And it gave me an insight to how foreign policy worked and how our government worked. Now, what caused me to write the book was, like all of us in the United States and probably the world, after 9/11, we in the United States, we were alarmed. That was the first time that our country had been hit so hard by a foreign force. You know, the first time would be in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, but actually on the mainland. And we were all disturbed behind that. And I say this quite frank with you, Glenn, you know, we wanted revenge because we felt we had been hit. And so there started the so-called quote, war on terror and our invasion of Afghanistan to take down the Taliban. Then all of a sudden, we started hearing, those of us in the military, that we were deploying forces throughout the Middle East to get ready for a war in Iraq. And I just didn't understand that. And from my time of working in U.S. Space Command and NORAD at the time, my boss was General Richard Myers, who went on to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who led the military during the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And there were members of my staff when I left Space Command that wanted to go to the Pentagon. They thought it would be a highlight of their career. And so I had a number of folks on the staff and some officers I had worked in previous years. And I was calling them and asking, where is this intel on Iraq having weapons of mass destruction? Because I have young men and women coming to me saying, Chief, which was my title at the time, the short for Command Chief Master Sergeant, they called me Chief. Why are we going to war in Iraq? Some of their family members were asking me that same question. And Glenn, I had no answer for them. And my credibility with the troops was my integrity, to be honest with them. And the only answer I had for them was that we have to follow the orders of our senior leadership. Only if we feel that their orders are unethical or illegal can we not follow. And not knowing whether or not Iraq had WMD or not, we couldn't not follow those orders. But it always bothered me, and I couldn't send young men and women off the war, something I didn't understand or believe in. On the officer side of the house, they can choose to retire. On my side, up to enlisted, if you they can choose to resign, I'm sorry. On the enlisted side of the house, if you're eligible for retirement, you can retire. And I just couldn't see myself sending men and women off to war that I didn't understand, that I didn't believe. So after retirement, somehow I got pulled back into the Pentagon. And I called it divine intervention. As I got called back into the Pentagon, I became part of a team that was put together to look over all the pre-planning war documents for Afghanistan and, in my particular interest, Iraq. How do we get there? Now, it was under the disguise because of the historical controversy of the Iraq war, we needed to declassify as many documents as we could. And so, man, that really caught my attention. I'll get a chance to say, hey, if you really go to war on WMD. And so that's why I call it divine intervention, something I always wondered, and I had an opportunity to see that. I ended up calling myself the poor man Daniel Ellsberg. If your audience have heard of Daniel Ellsberg, who's unfortunately since passed away. He was the author of the Pentagon Papers released in the New York Times. I called myself a poor man's, Daniel Ellsberg. I didn't have the guts that he had. I did it the proper way in writing my book, by way of writing my book and then sending it through the Pentagon for their review. And as you notice in the book, and your audience will notice in the book, it was heavily redacted. And redaction means there were things that they blacked out so that, the American public, could not know. Now, obviously, yes, please. Yeah.
I'm very happy you left this in, by the way, the redaction. It's
And Glenn, I was going to tell you that for your audience, the reason I did that, with my former boss, General Myers, I showed it to him. Most of the time, authors and publishers may, fill in those blanks where they're redacted, and I decided, oh, no, we're not going to do that. I'm going to show where they redacted, to keep me from sharing other information. Oh, by the way, Glenn, which was unclassified information because I was part of the classification team, And now what made me write the book, Glenn, was that after I saw firsthand the lies that were being told that got us into the Iraq war, I started thinking, I said, man, this is shameful. It's disgraceful. Now, how did I come up with the title Deadly Betrayal? Well, periodically through the Pentagon, all the war wounded that were stationed at Walter Reed to recover. Walter Reed at the time was the major medical center in the Washington, D.C., where war wounded were returning from Afghanistan and Iraq. And after I left the Pentagon for a second time, I challenged my former boss, General Myers, and one other boss, General Officer, that we need to take care of our wounded warriors when they come back after sending them off to war. And after we saw the treatment of our war wounded, and it was disclosed in a Washington Post article in 2007, the treatment of our war wounded. And Glenn, they were treated badly. We were putting them in, listen, this is truthful, molded rooms to recover. And that bothered me. One other thing that made me write the book was periodically through the Pentagon, the war wounded would come through the Pentagon. We call it the Hall of Heroes, where we would come through the Pentagon, we would cheer them on, thank you for your service and all that good stuff. And it hit me that these individuals had no idea why we went to war. Like everybody else, they said, oh, it was about the revenge for President George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush. It was about all. And nobody really knew the true reason. And that bothered me. And then I realized 4,500 of our U.S. military men and women had died in that war that was based on a lie. Also, I took it further. I realized the number of Iraqis that we had killed, the infrastructure we had destroyed based on a lie. And I felt I had to write that book. Here it is. I was in a room full of history. And we, at the time, I was really, to be honest with you, Glenn, focusing on the military. I was one of them. And we, the military, had no idea why we went to war. For the 4,500 that died and for their families, I thought it was only right for me to let their families know why they died. 4,500, a deadly betrayal of the military men of our United States Armed Forces.
Well, what from going through all these documents, so what kind of conclusion did you land on? Well, why did the United States invade Iraq? You mentioned some speculated the vengeance, the oil. Obviously, the weapons of mass destruction was the key reason, but well, the key reason given. I mean, but once that turned out to be nothing there, the fallback justification seemed to be to bring democracy and freedom. So kind of a modern civilizing mission, if you will. But when you go through the notes, so I guess you will come across two things. That is, one, what is the motivation behind it, but also how do you sell it? Because the genuine reason and how you present it to the public is very different. Again, when you want people to, when you want to make people do the worst, which is usually what you do in war, you usually have to appeal to the best in mankind to make them do the worst. So what did you learn from your notes, which you were hired to collect?
Well, Glenn, that is a great question, and it ties in what you mentioned in the introduction, how it ties into today, what's going on in the Middle East. You know, to my surprise and my disappointment, this war was never about the defense of the United States. It was never about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. It was only used as an excuse of rationale. And I will tell you, there were many in the intelligence world telling the Bush administration there was no WMD. And in fact, if they indeed had WMD, we have no idea where they are, but we don't know if they even have them or not. So I will tell you this, Glenn, the Bush administration came in with the desire to go to war with Iraq. It was nothing about WMD at the time. Why, you would ask that, Glenn? Well, because of the fact that there were those, you've heard the term neocons, that was pushing for us to go to war for many years. And the first Iraq war, when we went in under George H.W. Bush to remove Saddam out of Kuwait, there were some at the time, Paul Wolfowitz, who was an undersecretary of defense, wanted us to stay and hold on to Iraq. Now, why was that? Well, you will find in the book that the sole reason to go into Iraq was on behalf of Israel. Now, why would you say that? Now, what's going on right now, Glenn? This is something that Bibi Netanyahu has always wanted to do. Now he's being straight. He's telling the world there would be no two-state solution. We will annex the West Bank. We are going in and control Gaza. If we have to kill every man and woman and destroy every building, as we're seeing right before our eyes. You know, this is not an opinion. This is not a something. We are seeing it. Now, this is something Bibi Netanyahu always wanted to do. And during the George H.W. Bush administration, he was working closely with them. People like Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, and an individual by the name of Richard Pearl. Rumsfeld, his wanting to go to war was American imperialism, America's exceptionalism. You know, he felt that, you know, America, listen to this, was the only superpower. And we should be able to have the bully pulpit to do whatever we so desire. And our goal should be to make peace in the Middle East, and how? By using our military force. Now, how does it tie in? Bibi Netanyahu has always wanted to go in and just fully, as I alluded to earlier, and destroy Gaza, primarily Hamas and Hezbollah, the fighting wings of the folks that are fighting for their lives and their land. We didn't want Bibi to do that. because of the fact, as you see what's happening now, the killing and destruction, and now Israel's been isolated by the world. You might as well include the U.S. because we're the only true backer of Israel right now. And so the George W. Bush administration didn't want him to do that. So what was our answer to that? We were going to do traditional warfare. We were going to take out those countries that supported and backed Hezbollah and Hamas. And at the time, those three countries were Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And the reason we chose Iraq first, because under the Bill Clinton administration, the neocons forced, and I really mean forced, President Clinton at the time to come up with a regime change policy for Iraq. Now, what gives us the right to go in and change the regime of another country? But Bill Clinton didn't follow through that because we didn't have no excuse to do that, Glenn. We had no excuses to go in and change, even though there are some that think we can do that, like Rumsfelds of the world, but we couldn't do it. So along come the Bush administration with the bright idea, okay, we're going to take out those countries, but how do we do it? Unfortunately, Glenn, there are conspiracy theorists, and they've tried to get me to say this. I don't know. I only can give you facts, what I know, and an assumption and opinions. You've heard many folks say, hey, it was an inside job with 9/11. That I don't know. But there are some people that really can convince you of that. You look at the way these buildings fell down. But I'm not into that conspiracy theory. But what I can tell you to be a fact is that there were those in the Pentagon, unfortunately, the 3,000 lives that were lost on 9/11, they were glad it happened. And Glenn, why were they glad it happened? Because it gave us the opportunity to create the so-called war on terror, to go after any country that allegedly supported terrorism. And that gave us the opportunity to go after those three countries of Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Why did we go after Iraq first? It was because of the fact, as stated earlier, we had a regime change policy already in place. We were going to go after Iraq first, then Syria, and then we were going to save Iran for last because we knew it would be a harder battle. As we now know, both Israel and the United States know now, it would be hard to take out Iran. Now, you've heard in press here in the last, I'll say 6 or 7 months, about General Wesley Clark, one of the retired generals in the United States, from the United States Army, mentioned there were 7 countries that we're going to go after. It was disappointing. Wesley Clark knows this because he saw it. That was one of the documents that we declassified. And that was a true statement which Wesley Clark, made. We were going after these 7 countries because of the fact that we felt that they were the ones that were supporting terrorism against Israel. And that was our real reason. Oil was a secondary. That was one of the things that they redacted in my book. You had some oil magnates, some oil folks that wanted to go in. I tell folks, President Donald Trump says the quiet part out loud when he was saying, hey, we should have kept the oil in Iraq, where there are some that wish we had done that. But the primary focus was to go in and take out those countries. Now, let me share something with you. 9/11 was our excuse to be able to do that, because before then, we were trying to come up with all kinds of excuses. After the first Iraq war with Saddam, when we moved them out of Kuwait, and I said there were some that wanted us to stay there, and we didn't. There was folks that were really disappointed about that. And then how's the tie-in now? 9/11 gave us an excuse to do that. It failed because of the Iraqi insurgents. We got bogged down in Iraq. We couldn't take out Syria, though we've eventually done it. This is a long-term plan, but we couldn't do it at the time. Bibi was upset about that. But guess what? October 7th happens. That gave him the excuse to do what he wanted to do all along. And how do you tie it in? As I tell folks, I can give you facts. You can look it up. You've heard Bibi say himself, October the 7th is our 9/11. And that gave him the excuse to do that. And but before that, on behalf of Israel and Bibi Netanyahu, who was then at the time, was not the prime minister working with the Bush administration, he was the finance minister at the time, but he carried a lot of power in Iraq. He's the longest reigning, more times prime minister than anybody in history in Iraq, and he carries a lot of power. So the bottom line was some secondary reasons why we went to war, one being imperialism, but was on behalf of Israel to take out those 3 countries that were resistant that America's might in supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. And let me just mention one other thing that you said earlier about democracy. I can tell you this, and it is in the book. George W. Bush really believed in democracy, and that was his reason for going to war. He thought if we use a bullet pulpit and force and take out those countries, then the Palestinians, with no military support, no armed support, we have no reason, no choice but to have peace with Israel, based on America's and Israel's demands. That was a lot there, but I just wanted to get it all out, and I'll stand by for more questions.
No, well, the political leaderships were, the excitement of 9/11 as an opportunity, and how it's linked to the wars surrounding Israel is quite fascinating, though. And as you mentioned, General Wesley Clark was and the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. The fact that he, very openly stated, spoke about this classified memo is also interesting, because these 7 countries were Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and he made the point, we'll finish off with Iran. This is very accurate. Well, all of these countries have either directly or indirectly been attacked since then, and it is one can't really use the word conspiracy theory when you have the political leaderships and the military leaders stating it out in the open. But I also heard that the fact that the regime change in Iraq has also been at one point that this was a goal been labeled a conspiracy theory. But as you suggested, in October of 1998, Congress passed and President Bill Clinton signed into law the Iraq Liberation Act, which is American law to have Iraq government replaced. I mean, how? And still, this is denounced as a conspiracy theory, but it's right there. It's law.
Hey, Glenn, I'm just going to say that. Here, listen to what you just said. It was law. He followed. It was not a policy. It was a law, and that is amazing. And you're right. Sometimes I think, some of these folks think we're fools. It's happening right before our eyes. Even, there's people don't like to use the term that's going on today, genocide, but we see it. I tell folks, thank goodness for social media. We are seeing it real time. In the past, when you tie into what the United States has been doing, even we in the United States, the people didn't know what was really going on in Gaza. Didn't know the plight of the Palestinians, because our news media is tied into it too. And thank goodness for social media, where we can see what's going on. And as you stated, Glenn, it's not conspiracy theories. We see it. We know it. And oh, by the way, those 7 countries, there's only one that's standing now, and that is Iran. We've taken them all out, from Gaddafi, Assad, even though we didn't kill him. We wanted to, but he's now in Russia. We took out Saddam, and Iran is still standing. And the reason we saved them for last is because of the fact that we knew it would be a harsh undertaking. Now, let me share something else with you too. When we came up under the Obama administration with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, one of the things that neocons and hardcore warmongers in the United States wanted was for the Iranians to get rid of their ballistic missile program. And that was a non-starter for them. Why? So that's their first line of defense, their ballistic missile program. And we were scared of that. And it's proven to be why we saved Iran for last when we attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, and they retaliated with their ballistic missiles. And let me just tell you something, Glenn, those ballistic missiles are very accurate too. They're very accurate. So that was one of the reasons we wanted to save them for last. The other reason, which we saw happen as well, in Iraq and in Syria, they were somewhat broken countries. You need the strong arm, leaders of Assad. Assad was really a minority, there, and likewise with Saddam. When you talk about the Shias and the Sunnis, Saddam was a Sunni leader, minority in a majority Shia country. And so they figured that we could have an easy time in overthrowing those two individuals. But in Iran, they're Persians. They come together as a people in time of them, being attacked or threat. And so that was one of our other fears as well, that the Iranian people will come together and it would be hard to come under as we did in Iraq. It would be a cakewalk. The people in Iraq will welcome us. And so that was the other reason why we saved Iran for last.
Yeah, well, I want to then ask a bit about how the wars, how you saw them being sold, because there's this leaked report from the CIA that when the Europeans were beginning to lose interest in Afghanistan, they came up with this idea that, well, the Europeans really care about women's rights, so let's sell the war as that we want to enable little girls to go to school. So you had NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He co-authored an article with Hollywood's Angelina Jolie, why NATO is now the main as a supporter of women's rights in Afghanistan. So suddenly 2 decades of occupation became an issue for, women's rights. But, in Iraq, it was democracy. The destruction of Libya was done for human rights. The destruction of Syria was for human rights. And but you do have an entire chapter, though, in your book on disinformation strategy, which is the propaganda campaign, PR, how to sell a war to the public. Because when you go through these documents, why do we want this war, and also how do we sell this war? What kind of conclusions could you reach, or what have you learned in terms of how at the top level they think about the great ways to sell war?
Well, let me just share this with you, Glenn. None of our wars, from the United States perspective, have never been about humanity. It's never been about women's rights. It's always been about power, imperialism, and just controlling the world, to be quite frank with you. Now, how did they sell the war to, in particularly, which I will focus on, the American people? You remember when I stated that there were some in the Pentagon that were glad that 9/11 happened, and I really mean that. Well, why? That gave us the rationale and justification to go to war under the disguise of the war on terror, because of the fact we could never let that happen again. In other words, the bottom line, I hate to use a term, I don't like to curse, but they scared the hell out of the American people to say, if we don't go to war, this could happen again. And the American people jumped on board with that. I'm glad in the United States, I'm so disappointed, because of the fact the Republican Party here, one of our main parties, was always been, military minded, war minded. And the Democrats were, better known as, the peace party, if you will. But that changed in the second Iraq war that eventually took Saddam down. You had a presidential election. Another way how they thought about this war and with America's support is the Republicans went after the Democratic Party by way of saying they were weak on defense, if you will. And there were three individuals that was running for president at the time: Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton. And in part of that disinformation campaign, they were going to put out a campaign to tell the world, the people of the United States, that, hey, these folks don't want to protect you. They're weak on defense. Another 9/11 could happen, or something worse than 9/11. So you have people like them at the time, knowing possibly that there was no WMD, jumped on the bandwagon to say, okay, we have to go to war with Iraq. And so that was very disappointing to me. But the primary reason how they sold this war was by way of scaring the American people to death. And one of the weapons they used in this disinformation campaign here in the United States, the American people feel that general officers have a lot of credibility. And it was a campaign to use, unfortunately, general officers to get out on the Fox News and the CNNs of the world and talk about how Saddam was a threat to us. And unfortunately, they used the military, general officers that were retired, to sell this war as well, because people in the United States feel that, general officers are credible. Now, in regards to the world, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, different from the George H.W. Bush administration, where they put together a campaign of the willing during that time. The George W. Bush administration didn't care about that. They didn't care. We would go in alone. You heard Rumsfeld say that many a times. But when you mentioned about selling the war, Germany and France didn't really want to go to war. You remember we wanted to change the name of French fries to freedom fries and so forth. And you'll see in the book, we kept a lot of information from Germany and France because of the fact that when we knew that Saddam didn't have WMD, we didn't let Germany and France know that because, in fact, we were scared they would go to the United States Security Council and stop the war. The only three countries that we really kept abreast of what we were doing, well, really two primarily, was the UK, you wouldn't be surprised at that, and Israel. They knew exactly what the plan was and so forth, and but all the other countries, we kept isolated because we were really afraid that, in particular, Germany and France. And we had an individual that you'll see in the book that represented Saddam. When he realized that we were truly going to war, he sent someone to talk to Richard Pearl to say, hey, listen, we'll give the Americans anything they want, mining rights, oil rights. We'll try to do everything we can to help the Middle East Arabs make peace with Israel. We'll do everything. And they knew this guy was credible. We didn't tell Germany and France about that because we knew they would stop the war, to march the war. And so no matter what, to carry out this plan, if Saddam would have given up, we were going to war. There's no question about that.
The great irony, though, is, well, not irony, but that the excitement you describe over the September 11 attacks, that this could be used.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, well, this gave rise to the global war on terror, which essentially point to someone, they're terrorists now. It legitimizes use of force. But, as you speak, you have this big meeting now in New York with the United Nations. And I'm not sure if you saw this talk. It's on stage. You have CIA Director David Petraeus meeting with Jolani, the former Al-Qaeda leader. And only a few days ago, Jolani was outside taking pictures from the New York skyline where there used to be some more buildings. And Petraeus is just fawning over him, going, oh, we used to be on opposite side. We're fighting each other in Iraq, and now we're here on the same. But, I'm not sure what he was supposed to communicate because until recently, the United States had a bounty on his head as a terrorist. And now we're friends. Still a terrorist, but now we're on the same side. I mean, how is this playing out in the U.S. Army and all the people who lost their fellow soldiers, their loved ones, and now this is where we are. I mean, it's mind-boggling, though.
Listen, our foreign policy, remember I said, it's never about humanity. It's never about truly saving the world. It's about imperialism. That didn't set no precedents. Think about this for a moment. Rumsfeld with Saddam. There's a picture. You can go in and Google it out there. Saddam. We were friends with Saddam because of the fact when the war between Iraq and Iran was going on. Think about when at the time the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Guess who we supported? Obama. I'm sorry. Oh, that's a slip there. Osama bin Laden. Almost sound like a Republican talking point there. Osama bin Laden. We supported him against the Soviet Union. And so now, look, what we're going to use him for? Israel. To make peace with Israel. So I'm not surprised at that, and it hurts. Listen, you'll see in a chapter 2, Glenn, in the book for your audience. The United States Armed Forces are used as pawns in foreign policy. Now, that's not nothing I said. That's what Henry Kissinger said. God rest his soul, if you will. But he said that. We in the military, that's what made me write my book. I wanted our military to understand this. We are used as pawns in foreign policy. When you mentioned about how do we feel and so forth. That was the reason I wrote my book. We got to understand that, we got to stand up. We got to be able to trust our leaders that they're sending us off the war truly in the defense of our nation. And I can tell you, every war since World War II has not been about the defense of our nation here in the United States. And we pull along other countries into these wars with us.
Yeah, one often comes up with these slogans as well to push a war. So, for example, in Iraq, a common one was, support the troops, which was meant to keep the war going. And, this is a sentiment or a concept that everyone can get behind. I mean, these are young men prepared to give their lives for their nation. I mean, who doesn't want to support them? But you can fill this concept with any content you will. I mean, because if you support the troops, you would suggest, well, let's only put them in harm's way when necessary. And, if you support them, this is the only time you put them in harm's way. But instead, it's used as a slogan for, we will never end this war. Just as John McCain said, talk to our guys. They said, just give us, we can stay there for 100 years. So, it's a very manipulative way of using the language. I did want to ask
Hey,
though.
Glenn, let me
Yeah,
go
sorry.
ahead. I want to comment on that, Glenn. Yeah, I'm just enjoying your questions. You are spot on in some of your questions. Some of us veterans now are saying, I am so sick and tired of politicians, but it's gone all the way down to normal everyday citizens. They tell us in the military when they found out we're veterans, thank you for your service. And that's just, to build us up, but really we've been abused. So now I tell folks, no, you thank, especially those that have been in combat, have been wounded, you thank them for their sacrifice. You thank them for being abused, by our government. Glenn, you'll notice one thing in my bio and also in the book, I talk about the wounded warriors, that we have. And I remember, I tell folks, I probably could have got fired from that job. I was a representative for the Air Force over at the major medical center I mentioned the previous, Walter Reed. And used to have members of Congress to come over and want to thank, our wounded for their service. You had folks with amputees, double amputees, triple amputees, lost both arms and legs. And they were going, oh, thank you for your service. Just, and it used to bother me. And I remember telling one particular congressman, Congressman, I'm not wounded. Maybe you can thank me for my service. You so desire to do that, but you need to thank them for the sacrifice, them and their families for the sacrifice they've made. And unfortunately, a sacrifice based on a lie. Based on a lie. And I got to tell you, Glenn, knowing that, shame on me if I didn't write my book, knowing what I know. Shame on me if I didn't let the public know that our military is used and abused by our foreign policy.
You mentioned before, though, that Germany and France were being kept in the dark in the fear that they would want to perhaps stop the war if they knew that the Iraqis were, desperate to find a path to peace. But how did Washington deal with international institutions, though? Because you have the IAEA, the International Agency the International Atomic Energy Agency, and you also have the United Nations. Then under Blix, who was going to come and inspect.
Hans Blix.
Yeah, how did Washington, I guess, undermine international institutions, though, who would seek a peaceful path and prevent the war plans?
Glenn, what another great question and observation. Under that disinformation strategy we talked about, unfortunately, the United States had plans already to discredit both of them. We were told eventually that by the inspection agency that Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction. So we had plans in place, and that is in the book, to discredit both of those individuals, to say that Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, and here's where they were. They were made-up sites. Made-up sites. And as we all know now, WMD was never found because there was no WMD to be found. And so we had a discredit campaign against those two individuals in the United Nations. And the bottom line, I will tell you again, Glenn, no matter what, you heard, those previous administration officials at the time, Rumsfeld, Cheney, if we have to go in alone, we will do that. And they did that. And once again, something you said earlier, uh, conspiracy theories. These are not conspiracy theories. They did it. And now, as we can see, Bibi Netanyahu is just really, he doesn't care anymore. He's telling us what he's going to do. And this has been his plan all along.
And well, I wanted to ask also about the credibility, because in your book you do write from Rumsfeld to Condoleezza Rice, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld. I mean, they all seem very, in terms of motivation, organized around the idea that U.S. credibility has to be preserved, and that requires war, as opposed to the fear of being seen to run away. I mean, is this the idea that if they would accept a peaceful settlement or a negotiated outcome, that this would make the U.S. look weak? Or how much of the eagerness for war or war enthusiasm is what was explained by this, the drive for enhancing U.S. credibility?
Glenn, another great question. When I was trying to think what should the title of my book be, one of the first thoughts that came to mind was credibility. Truth, why we went to war. Because of the fact, and this is particularly Rumsfeld, he felt that America's credibility was on the line. How did that start off? Well, as I mentioned earlier, under the Bill Clinton administration, we had a regime change policy for Iraq. And Bill Clinton didn't do anything about that. And so Rumsfeld felt that that was against our credibility. We had no credibility to have a regime change policy in Iraq, and we hadn't done anything about it. And so that was one area. The big thing with Rumsfeld was also, it showed, he said, in the Middle East, he was saying those countries frown on weakness. And he said that it was making us look weak, that we had a regime change policy and we had not taken out Saddam. Also, he stated, we are the only superpower, but yet we're showing weakness by not using that superpower status. These are all facts that I'm telling you. I can give you a business up. These are facts that I'm telling you, that he felt that we had to use, our force to maintain our credibility in the world as the only superpower. And we can talk about that now. That's how it ties in with the Russia-Ukraine war and China, if you will. We always have some ghost that we're chasing. And it's all about us being a superpower, somebody challenging us. And when I say the neocons and the warmongers in the United States, this plan goes all the way back to 1990. As I stated, there were some when we went into Iraq the first time to remove them out of Kuwait. And I mentioned that Wolfowitz was part of the administration at the time, the George H.W. Bush administration, and was an undersecretary of defense and wanted us to stay there. This has been a long-range plan going all the way back to 1990s. They call it the Wolfowitz Doctrine, where we should just go in and bulldoze any country we so desire. And that was Rumsfeld's mentality too, as well. And so, it's all about America's imperialism and power, and as being the only superpower in the world and dictating to the world how the world should be.
Well, my last question is, based on your final chapter, which is, very fitting, which is, can this happen again? And I think, again, it's cliche, but we should learn from history, and especially this history, because a lot of the wars are still continuing today. And then, in this case, the war in Syria, the destruction of Gaza, and a likely second war against Iran, which will probably be much more brutal. But also, as you mentioned, Ukraine, at least in my lifetime, I have never seen such overwhelming, very obvious and yet shameful lies and propaganda. It's really overwhelming, especially here in Europe, but also the demonization and the normalization of the idea of war against China. It's just it's really a dangerous time. So I like the idea of learning something from when we began to go off the rails, which seems to be in the early 2000s at least, if not sooner. But how can we prevent? What can be done to, I guess, get back on track here?
Well, Glenn, when I wrote that chapter, Can It Happen Again? I got on this crusade to stop what is happening, whether it be in Ukraine, in Russia, or whether it be war with Iran or Syria at the time, because Iraq has already been taken down. I have failed. Can it happen again? I warned us, specifically, because the United States is leading this charge. I was trying to say that, listen, we got to watch who our presidential candidates surround themselves with, because of the fact, if not, we'll be pushed into war. Now, let me just mention something about this plan. I mentioned about Paul Wolford. It goes all the way back to the 90s, to Wolford's doctrine. And the neoconservatives, better known as the neocons, they believe in American exceptionalism and us controlling the world. And so when you say, prevent this from happening, part of that strategy back then was to counter the then Russia, as they, migrated from Soviet Union to being Russia, to counter that, to make sure they do not be an equivalent to us. And so it goes all the way back to then, as you stated then. So my goal is to let American people know, and the world know, that our goal is not to have no other superpower do we dictate everything. So let's look at that for a moment. It goes all the way back to the Ukraine war now, after the Soviet Union was disbanded and the Warsaw Pact was disbanded. Nothing on paper, but it's public. You can go to our archives. We told Russia that we will not expand NATO. And what do? We expanded NATO. Okay? China. It went from being someone we worked together with, unfortunately, during the Richard Nixon administration to get cheap labor. It became a partner. And then they all of a sudden, China liked this, we'll call it quasi-capitalism. They love this capitalism. China have billionaires now and millionaires, even though they're a so-called communist country, but they are a quasi-capitalist country. They became a competitor. We in the United States didn't like that. So all of a sudden now China is becoming an adversary. When I was in the Pentagon, when you mentioned about the Undersecretary of Defense Policy I was working at, that was in 2008 and 9. We looked at, then we were already turning to look at China. How do we make them to an adversary? Because they're getting too powerful, both militarily and economically. The reason they become military power because we were a threat to them. We were threatening them. And so likewise with Russia, Putin, you get a man that's a nationalist himself to say, hey, we're going to show you. You're not the only superpower. If you remember, Glenn, in your audience, after the end of the Cold War, we in the United States were just so arrogant. We were around and saying we won the Cold War. We're the only superpower in the world. That's not conspiracy. We said that. You get somebody come on like Putin and say, okay, we'll show you. Likewise, China is showing us now. So they've learned. Now, Glenn, you also need to remember is that I'm really afraid, you've heard some say, way things are going right now, the only way the United States could really win a major war with China or Russia is by nuclear war. And that's somewhat, frightening. And I don't think when we say lessons learned, I don't think Russia or China will sit back and let us be the first use of a nuclear weapon, because we've already shown we would do that. Just ask Japan. We're the only country to ever use a nuclear or an atomic weapon. And so we're in some tough times, right now in the Middle East. I think Bibi Netanyahu's back is against the corner right now. He's been so isolated, not only internationally, but nationally in his country too. And, it remains to be seen what happened. Now, think about this for a moment to draw us in. I'm talking about Bibi Netanyahu. Now he's threatening China, if you will, and he knows that's, one of the areas we're looking at right now, potential war against China. And Bibi's egging that on right now, to get us in another war because China is really standing up to Israel right now. So, Glenn, we have some tough times ahead. And when you said, my last chapter, can it happen again? Well, yes, it can, and more. And I'm so disappointed in saying, and so in that regard, in my goal to do whatever I could to bring about a more peaceful world, it's sad that I'm failing, and a lot of us are failing.
In a rewrite, a new edition, you might change the title of, here we go once again. But it is sad, though, to see the exact same play being played over and over. And it's always the same. We see Afghanistan, we say, oh, well, it turns out afterwards it was based on fraudulent claims. We see the same Iraq, Libya, but then whatever the war of the day is now, for example, Ukraine, it's well, this time it's different, and whoever criticizes it, well, they stand with the enemy, and if you're really patriotic, you would cheer on this war, which will bring disaster to us all. But this is I don't know, the current time now. It just seems so much more severe. The complete the genocide broadcasted in Gaza, war against Russia, the largest nuclear power, the bombing of nuclear reactors in Iran, and of course war with China. It's just it's very different than the more medium-sized and small countries which we destroyed throughout the 2000s. So
Glenn, you said irony a few minutes ago. America has this philosophy and theme, peace through strength. And right now, this so-called strength is causing a disaster.
very much agree. So yes, I can't recommend this book enough, Deadly Betrayal. I will leave a link in the description, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about your book.
Glenn, thanks so much for having me. You take care.